We are so honored to be here to share our work on LGBTQ with you all. So I want to take us on a little thought experiment right now. And so I want you to imagine that we were just all transported together to Chicago, and we're standing underneath the beam. So the mirrored structure in Chicago. And so you went there with the people that you're here with, or you're there with the people that are next to you right now. And you're standing up and you're looking at the beam, and you don't see yourself reflected. Everybody else around you is looking at the beam next to you, and you look up and you see their reflection. They see their own reflection, but you do not see yours. Adrienne Rich, the American poet, put words to this experience. She said, and I'm going to paraphrase here, that when someone with the authority, say of a teacher, describes the world, and you're not in it, there's a moment of psychic disequilibrium, as if you looked into a mirror and saw nothing. Unfortunately, this is the reality of LGBTQ young people, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning young people every day in their families, in their schools, in their communities, in the books that they read, in the media that they engage with. They are not represented in those contexts. And we know representation is key for health and well-being. And representation is the heart of Mapping Q. Mapping Q is a suicide prevention program for LGBTQ young people. And later, my colleague here, Chelsea, will talk about what Mapping Q is, how it came to be, and we'll both talk about the incredible impacts that it makes in the lives of LGBTQ young people. And so first, let me back up. Why are we focused on LGBTQ young people? So we're in the midst of multiple pandemics right now. We're in the midst of the pandemic of COVID-19 still. We're in the midst of the pandemic of racism, which was heightened during the racial awakening after the murder of George Floyd. We're also in the midst of a pandemic of a youth mental health crisis. So among youth aged 10 to 24, suicide is the second leading cause of death. This number has risen substantially over the past 2 decades. The CDC reports that this number has risen by 60% over the past 2 decades of youth dying to suicide. But like the COVID-19 pandemic and the racism pandemic and this mental health crisis among youth, it doesn't affect all young people equally. Sexual and gender minority youth, or LGBT youth, have some of the highest levels of suicidality compared to any other adolescent population. My collaboration with the Search Institute, we used data from 120,000 adolescents in the US. They were aged 11 to 19. And so we were able to look at differences within subgroups of how did suicide experience differently by gender and bisexuality. And so if you look on this screen over here, you can see that transgender boys and non-binary kids had the highest levels of suicide attempts. And just to remind you again, these young people were aged 11 to 19, and half of them reported having attempted suicide during their lifetime. Transgender girls over here, and then questioning over here, youth who are still questioning their gender, about a third of them had attempted suicide. This is compared to just 10% of cisgender boys, so cisgender being boys who were assigned male at birth and who identify as a boy, and 17% of cisgender girls. Alarming disparities. And as it says on the screen over here, it's a reality that doesn't have to be. We also looked at sexual orientation differences in suicide attempts. And here we find similarly alarming findings. 50% of bisexual youth had attempted suicide in their life. Mostly lesbian and gay, or only lesbian and gay, 40% of them had attempted suicide. Even youth who identified as mostly heterosexual, so think Katy Perry's, I kissed a girl and I liked it. Not LGBT, identified, but not 100% straight either. 25% of them had attempted suicide, compared to 10% of youth who identified as only heterosexual. Again, this is a reality that doesn't have to be. We can change society. We can change the impact of discrimination for these young people. So why do these disparities exist? So I'll start with why this disparity, one reason why we don't see this disparity, and that is, and I'm starting with this because there is a myth that there is something innately wrong with LGBT people that is the reason that we see these high differences in mental health outcomes. But that is not true. That is a myth. We know from decades of research now that LGBTQ youth are at heightened risk for suicide because of their experience of discrimination and bias and stigma in society. LGBTQ youth experience this discrimination and stigma in society in multiple contexts: their schools, their families, their communities, and in multiple ways. So at school, they might experience peer victimization or even victimization and bullying from the adults in that school context. LGBT young people are also more likely to experience family rejection when they disclose or when their identity is found out by their parents. LGBT young people represent 40% of the homeless youth population, largely due to kick out of homes after that disclosure. And importantly, structural level policies play a role in these disparities as well. It's not just interpersonal in nature. And so we know that legislation that seeks to legislate exclusion, hate, and legislation that seeks to limit the rights of LGBTQ young people is also associated with poor mental health outcomes. And we would be remiss if we did not address that we are here in Texas, where just 2 weeks ago, the two highest authorities in the state attempted to pass a policy or to create a policy that labels parents who love and who support their children as child abusers. We know that those policies have implications for the health and well-being and are one of the reasons that we see this disparity in suicide. Another reason for this disparity in suicide outcomes among LGBTQ youth is representation. So I'm bringing us back to where we first came together in talking about representation. If you can think about, am I represented in this world? We know that that has several implications for hope, for the ability to think about and create a different future for yourself. And so youth, when they are represented, in my own research, I have found that when youth are represented in the curriculum at school, when LGBT people and their lives and their histories are included in that curriculum, they experience better academic achievement and better mental health. And so representation is critical. And again, representation is the heart of Mapping Q. And so I'm going to pass it on over to Chelsea, who will tell you more about that program.
Thank you, Russ. So as Russ mentioned before, Mapping Q is a program that is operated at the University of Arizona Museum of Art, which is where I work. It's an art-based suicide prevention program for LGBTQ youth ages 13 to 24. And during this program, youth are invited to investigate the space of the museum, interrogating and finding out what are the representations, what are the identities that are represented, and finding those gaps of representation. We also partner with the Southern Arizona AIDS Foundation in Tucson, and they offer suicide prevention workshops all throughout the sessions of Mapping Q, where youth are learning to identify the risk factors of suicide and learning how to have suicide prevention conversations with their peers. And all during that time period, we're also making artwork as a way to intentionally insert those identities that they are seeing are not represented, to insert those, to fill the void of that representation. So Mapping Q actually comes out of my experience teaching art at a high school in Tucson, Arizona. I was also the sponsor of the Gay Straight Alliance Club at this school. And during my time there, teaching for about 8 years, I was witness to the institutional homophobia and unequal treatment of sexual and gender divergent students on the campus. And the students were really struggling to have their voices heard and to be trusted when they were saying that these incidents were occurring. So as an art teacher, I found an art-based way to respond to that. We created an enlarged watercolor map of the school campus, and we invited students throughout a period of about 3 months to physically map where these instances of bullying and harassment because of their identity were occurring on campus. So we learned how many times it was happening, but significantly, we learned where it was happening. I assumed, like probably many of you, that these occurrences were most likely going to be in the hallways and in bathrooms, peer-to-peer interactions. The mapping was incredibly powerful because it revealed a hidden curriculum that was occurring on our campus. Because what we actually found, what we found is that I don't know how to use a clicker. What we found is that this section right here, this is the administrative building, and these are classrooms behind the administrative building. So the highest rates where students were feeling harassed and intimidated because of their sexual or gender identity were in places where adults were in charge. Where adults had the authority to make the rules, to implement those rules, to hold other people accountable, and to model behavior. That is what we call in education the hidden curriculum. There was a curriculum that was being taught unintentionally or intentionally on our campus that was normalizing that harassment and bullying of LGBTQ students. It was teaching adults and students that it was normal to behave that way. And significantly, it was teaching LGBTQ students that their identities were not valued, that they were not welcome on the school campus. So the map was incredibly powerful. And I also want you to think about who gets to map. Think historically. Who has the power to map is those in power. And those in power have the ability to construct our sense of reality. And suddenly, these students had the agency and the power to construct their reality, to reveal their reality on this campus. Maps are incredibly powerful. The students also, through this process, got to see themselves through this mapping occurrence and also notice that they were not alone. So while I was doing this mapping on the school campus, while I was also a teacher at the high school, I was also a part-time educator at the Art Museum at the University of Arizona. And I became really curious. Okay, there's a hidden curriculum on our school campus. I'm also teaching in this informal setting at the Art Museum. Is there a hidden curriculum that I don't know about in the galleries in the museum? And so I wanted to find out. And reaching out to the Southern Arizona AIDS Foundation, they were also very interested in partnering, and that's when we created the first of its kind art-based suicide prevention program at a museum, which is now called Mapping Q. So we invited youth into the galleries. We gave them the tools for mapping. We gave them maps, we gave them pencils, clipboards, and said, go map our galleries. Go investigate what are the representations, what are the identities that you see, and use whatever visual language you want, whatever symbol system that you want to use to represent that in your maps. These are two examples. Two galleries, two different students mapping the same space, and you can see how their visual language is different. They're using different symbol systems. But as we found it when we would debrief after these programs, is that the youth were finding the same information. Majority of the artwork was produced by men. The subject matter of that artwork was predominantly women. And there was very little, if at any, representation of romantic or sexual coupling other than heterosexual coupling. It was as if, in the art world, LGBTQ people did not exist. And we all know we do exist. So what we found through Mapping Q is that the same thing was happening at our high school, at our school setting, was occurring in the museum setting. There was a hidden curriculum that was erasing so many voices, was erasing sexual and divergent people from the history books of our art museum. And so in Mapping Q, art making by and for youth becomes a way to insert those stories and identities and experiences back into the space. So I'll show you some examples. This is a beautiful monoprint made by artist Grayson, titled A Pillowcase with Sleeves. This monoprint also includes a text at the bottom I'm going to have a hard time reading. Sorry. I'm going to hover over people and make them feel really uncomfortable. You didn't know what you were getting into. It includes a text that says, "My skin is an ill-fitting fabric. I am incapable of tailoring." So a beautiful monoprint by Grayson, I think, does an amazing job of illustrating and communicating that sense that he felt in having a body that doesn't, quote unquote, fit, right? The artists are, during Mapping Q, are also encouraged to write their own labels. In Mapping Q, we offer label writing workshops because the museum will not interpret the work for the youth or to the youth. So they write their own labels. Grayson included this with theirs.
I'm trying to get ready to like myself again.
In Mapping Q, we also have an exhibition of the youth artwork. And in that exhibition space, visitors get a chance to understand what it means to be a queer youth today. And with Grayson's work, I think they get a sense of how LGBTQ youth are having to fight for that sense to like themselves. This very clever and sensitive work is by the artist Frankie. It's from 2016. Notice the title, Toilet Paper Rolls. Rolls is spelled R-O-L-E-S intentionally, as they were playing with this idea of gender being a role, being a performance that we inscribe or is inscribed upon us. Really, really clever use of language. Frankie said this about their work.
I am just a giant confusion to everyone. I'm a ball of anxiety and stress. Even writing this, I'm stressing out. This project is about these insecurities and the stressors that make my life harder, especially when I need to pee. I'm taking all the negativity out of the bathroom and making it a positive thing.
This work was made in 2016 at the time when there were many anti-trans bathroom bills that were being proposed across the United States. Again, as Russ mentioned, 8 years later, this work is still incredibly relevant and poignant. Speaking to the fact that many trans youth, gender divergent youth, experience anxiety and stress when they're in public and simply have to use a bathroom. The amazing thing with this work is that it included 3 toilet paper rolls that were installed on 3 different sides of a pedestal, each one with a different phrase. One was stamped saying "you're okay," one said "you're valid," and the other one said "you're loved." Frankie included an additional prompt on their label that invited people to take a square. So even while Frankie themselves was daily experiencing stress and anxiety because of their identity when they're in public spaces, they wanted visitors to their work, to their gallery, to walk away knowing that they're okay, you're loved, and you're valid. Elvis, as an amazing artist, actually participated in Mapping Q for 4 straight years. This, I think, was their second exhibition, titled Gender Depression Self-Portraits. It included self-portraits that they had created from the time that they were about 8 years old till they were 20. And they worked with me in a way to lay it out using a timeline, again, starting from 2005 all the way up until 2017. As I mentioned, Elvis worked with me in installing this work. Mapping Q as a program invites youth to participate behind the scenes in museums so that they can get a sense of what it's like, how museums function. Because even the choices that museums make upon how to install a work of art, where to place a label, and the words that we use in that label, all that has power and works to convey meaning. So this is what Elvis said about their work.
This is a map of myself throughout my own perspective. I want to show myself true and clear. I want to represent who I am in this space and time and who I have been.
Last artist I'll show you. This is Jed, amazing illustrator. This is all done by hand and ink. The title of it is Dysphoria, Part 1 of a series. Dysphoria is a feeling of unease and discomfort that some people feel when their gender does not match their sex assigned at birth. And so Jed was creating this work to express their feelings of dysphoria. Notice how we have the figure, their back is to us. We see their face reflected in a mirror, a handheld mirror, and they're touching their face in this kind of anxious way where it's almost like they're trying to make sure that that face, that physical body is the same one that's reflecting back in the mirror. There's a crack in the mirror, again, kind of symbolizing the sense of discomfort and strain. And in the background, these sad faces repeat, creating almost a wallpaper. This work of art by Jed does an amazing job of illustrating how skillful youth can be at visually communicating their emotional experiences. Jed said this about their work.
Sometimes I do not recognize myself. There's a battle between what I look like and who I am.
And who I know I am. That last part of Jed's label, I think, is one of the critical elements of Mapping Q. That I often say that what we need to do more of with youth is listen and trust. So as I mentioned, one of the end results of Mapping Q is an exhibition of their work. And this ties into the earlier inspiration of the mapping of the school setting, the high school, where in that process, the youth felt seen and realized that they were not alone. And the exhibition of their work has the same results, where here you see youth in Mapping Q literally looking at the work of art that they created, displayed prominently on the walls of the museum. And they're also walking around and they're seeing their friends and their peers' artwork displayed as well, seeing themselves represented and seeing that they are not alone. So, as we mentioned, representation matters. I believe that museums have an ethical obligation to account for the ways in which we have erased marginalized communities and voices throughout the museum. Mapping Q is a way that we do that. It's why Mapping Q started in 2014, because we know that representation does matter. And through the work of Russ, which he will illustrate here in a second, we know that representation in museums can help youth thrive.
All right, so with any program that we're putting resources, time, space, energy into, we need to know, is it working? Is Mapping Q effective in helping LGBTQ youth thrive in their oppressive world that they reside in? And so enter a multi-phase, multi-year research study in collaboration with Chelsea and the folks at UAMA and the Southern Arizona AIDS Foundation. So we provided surveys to youth at the beginning of Mapping Q, and then we resurveyed them at the end of Mapping Q. And we were primarily looking at 3 different areas. Do their symptoms around mental health change as a result of this program? Do their stressors change in their lives? And does their support level from their peers change? So first, we'll start with mental health symptoms. I will note we were not able to ask directly about suicidality. So even though our talk and our framework is around preventing suicide, we asked about indicators of suicide that are very strongly associated with whether a person ideates, thinks about suicide, or actually attempts and dies by suicide. We found a significant reduction in depressive symptoms. So 8% reduction in depressive symptoms from the beginning to the end of mapping Q, which was a moderately sized decrease in symptoms for these young people. We did not find a significant decrease in anxiety symptoms, which is actually consistent with other research on pilot studies, interventions with LGBTQ young people. Anxiety is really hard to break in terms of that every day walking through the world knowing that you're going to experience discrimination. But it's very promising here that we did find this significant decrease in depression. We also looked at 2 indicators of suicidality. And these 2 indicators are published in the adolescent literature, in the adult suicide behavior literature, and they're very strongly associated with whether someone actually attempts suicide or not. The first is called perceived burdensomeness, and this is the state of feeling that everybody else in your life, everybody in your world would be better off if you were gone. So we can think about how that it would be very strongly then associated with actual suicide ideation or attempt. Thwarted belongingness over here on the right-hand side is the idea or the state that you don't really fit in anywhere. There's no place that you belong as a human being. And so it's really this lack of meeting the need for connection that we as humans are hardwired for. We have a hardwired need for connection. I'm going to start with the right-hand side because we found a 20% reduction in thwarted belonging. This is a moderate to large size effect in terms of a decrease of this state of being. This is incredible, and it primarily speaks to the idea that this program brings youth together who have shared identities and shared experiences, and now they finally see themselves. They see themselves in their peers, and they're represented, and they have that sense of belonging to this new peer group that they've formed through mapping Q. We see a slight reduction in perceived burdensomeness. For any stats folks out there, it was not statistically significant, but we're also working with a really small sample here. So we did see a trend, at least, towards a reduction in that feeling like you're a burden to everybody just by your existence. Consistent with the idea of thwarted belongingness, we also found increases in support. 17% increase in peer support, and a 7% increase in feeling like you belong to the LGBTQ community. So if anything emerges from mapping Q and what we know from this quantifiable aspect of this prevention program, it's that it is really providing the context for building community, building support, and building connection with others. And of course, we don't always want to rely on quantifiable data. And so this was a multi-method study. We did interviews with the youth participants as well to really understand in their own words what was their experience of the program and what was most impactful for them. And so I'm going to play for you 2 quotes that are up here as well.
Because as someone who is only a youth but has experienced homelessness and is queer, I don't have many opportunities to be in a museum. I feel like it opened a door and said, you can do things like this.
And then the next quote from the other young person said this.
Because when you're disenfranchised when you're queer, you learn how to disappear or be invisible. And this allows us to be seen in the way we want to be seen.
So as you can interpret and see through these 2 quotes, they were very representative of the other stories that we heard from the youth from these interviews. Mapping Q finally allowed them a chance to see themselves, whether it was in the museum, during the exhibition, whether it was being in community with other LGBTQ folks, whether it was learning art making skills. Several of the youth actually talked about in the interviews, I can be an artist now. My work has been up in a museum. This is something I can do. And so it gave them that hope that so many young people lack in our society. Mapping Q was also critical for helping youth develop coping mechanisms. And so when you're walking through a world every day and breathing in oppression every day in every context that you're in, we need some strategies to help mitigate that experience of oppression. Oppression, I've been working in this field for about 25 years, maybe 30 as an advocate at this point. Oppression's hard to change. Systems are hard to change. I think if we've learned anything from the racial awakening over the past 2 years, we know that oppression, systems of oppression, are difficult to change. So we must also provide youth with the opportunity to build skills to cope with that experience of oppression. And so here's one example, and I'm going to play the audio for you, of a young person that talks about coping.
I used a lot of liquid watercolor because of how easy it was to manipulate. And sometimes when I was feeling really stressed, I would just pour a bunch of drops onto a page and I would just blow it around to just like scream without screaming. In a way, it helped me because it helped me calm down, and in the end, it looked really cool.
So I love this quote because I can't think of how many times as an adult who experiences oppression that I just want to scream, right? It's like that built up every day. I'm experiencing some form of oppression, discrimination, and you just want to scream. And this young person is now using the art skills that they learned through Mapping Q to scream without having to scream. The next year of Mapping Q, so this all happened the first year I had the honor of collaborating with Chelsea and UAMA. Throughout the end of that year, when we were going back to do the follow-up survey, the youth were like, Russ, we get that you need survey data, but we really just don't like filling out surveys. Like, can we do something else to evaluate this program? Is there another way that we can learn? And so enter a youth participatory action research project. And so we actually brought youth to the center. They became the researchers in this next part that you're about to see. So we engaged with them in what's called a photo voice project. So we were able to get some funds and we purchased disposable cameras for them, which was an interesting generational shift because most of them had never seen a disposable camera, let alone use one. But they had these cameras, and as a team, they themselves came up with the questions that they wanted to ask. And then they went out and they took the photos to answer those questions. And then they came together as a group and shared their photos and shared their experiences with one another and came to some conclusions about the two questions that they posed. And so they had two prompts that they collectively decided to take photos revolving around. That first prompt was my identity feels like, and the second prompt was my community looks like. And I'm about to show you some of their photos. So first, my community feels like. So up here you see a photo that the young person took of a sign of the Eon Youth Lounge, which is in Tucson, Arizona. That is our LGBTQ youth community center that just opened up a few years ago. And here is how the youth describes this photo.
Queer Youth Center entangled in my development. Eon for me is a space where my community and my identity begin to bleed together.
So this was a really common theme in the photos of young people talking about how it was really hard for them to disentangle their identity from their community because being part of community was their identity. And so it really, spoke to this idea that was found in the quantitative data as well around that importance and that salience of community and belongingness among youth. Another theme that came up that was actually quite unexpected for me as a researcher, I didn't anticipate that animals would be the focus of so many photos. And I can't even tell you how many photos there were of animals. And so here you see in this photo 2 cats on a bed, and this is what the young person says.
They're always here with me through everything.
Another young person took a photo of two horses, and here's their quote.
I was camping at a ranch, a part of a festival, and I absolutely fell in love with the horses. Even in chains, they're still free.
So those two photos are representative of a theme that we refer to as unconditional love from animals. LGBTQ young people are aware and experience that love from other humans is conditional. We can't rely on the other humans around us to love us unconditionally. But the youth in this study, so many of the photos revolved around this idea that my animals are always going to be there for me. And so for me, this opens up a whole new avenue of where we could go with prevention intervention efforts that involve animals and relationships with animals. Moving to identity, we see here a photo, and it is a bit blurry, but it was a disposable camera. And so it's a honey bear bottle that's broken on the asphalt, and it's spilling out onto the asphalt. And here's the quote that goes along with it.
I am honey, and I am this ant. I have been discarded. I am nourishment. I had to find the sweetness in myself, in this thrown away thing.
So this quote comes under a theme that we called messy, cluttered, and discarded. Many of the youth talked about their identity as knowing that it was easily discarded by society, thrown away. And as we see with some of the current legislation, there are literally attempts to rid states of trans kids. And so they were aware of this in terms of the way that they talked about their identity. But that's the negative side, right? I want you to focus on the end part of the statement. They had to find the sweetness and the beauty in themselves. This quote just is incredible in terms of thinking about the way that LGBTQ youth, even though they're discarded by society and are aware of that, they're still resilient and they're still able to find the beauty in themselves and others around them. As a developmental scientist, I was really happy to see this one. So this is the idea, the theme that young people see themselves as growing. They talk about this in their photos and the way that they describe their photos. And so you see here a picture that was taken from a moving bus of a tree with the sunlight behind it. And the young person says,
I reach for the sky while kept grounded, much like this tree.
and then over here you see a photo of a prescription box from a bottle of testosterone and a few of the needles to inject the testosterone. So testosterone is a gender-affirming hormone that some transmasculine, trans boys, non-binary kids may use to affirm their gender identity. And here's what the young person said.
Starting hormones is a big step to a brilliant mental state.
So again, they see growth, they see opportunity, they see resilience in terms of their experience. And then the last theme that I'm going to highlight is this idea of identity as resistance. And so here you see this photo of, it was taken from a parking lot and it was a sunset in the background. And here's what the young person had to say about it.
I am a ray of sunshine, even in the darkest moments.
Then a related photo, here is a vest that a young person wore during school. The vest has several different patches on it saying queer, minor threat. There's one at the bottom that I think is cut off that says actually suicidal on it. And here's what the young person said.
A battle vest that I've had since high school.
So given how systemic oppression is, many people talk about LGBTQ people just living is resistance. just the mere act of existing in society and choosing to get up out of that bed and walk through the halls of a cis-normative, heteronormative high school is resistance. And I love to end on this theme from the photos because it shows that LGBTQ youth are taking control of their environments. They are resisting, and they're actively engaging in that resistance to create a better current experience for themselves and a better future for LGBTQ young people. And so what we learned from our multi-phase research study is that Mapping Q provides a template for arts-based interventions to effectively engage LGBTQ youth in reducing their mental health burden and increasing their support context. And perhaps most importantly, increasing the representation of LGBTQ youth in cis-normative and heteronormative spaces. In a world where we have seen an unprecedented number of anti-trans and anti-LGBTQ youth legislation in the US, I think the last I heard was over 150 unique bills have been introduced just since January. We see that this type of program can provide some relief and provide the experience for youth to resist and to be resilient and thrive.
Thanks, Russ. So the earlier health statistics that Russ shared are scary and they're alarming. But as we said, that is not the dystopian future that has to be. Programs like Mapping Q provide students permission to love themselves exactly as they are, to resist that hidden curriculum that aims to erase them, and the possibility to imagine a future. Because when you see yourself literally represented positively in the current day, you have the ability to imagine yourself in the future. So we're going to end with the second image by Jed, this one titled Relief, or The Moment of Relief. Another incredible ink drawing. Here we say the absolute contrary to our first image, where the figure is turning, facing us boldly, displaying themselves exactly as they are in their full truth, arms raised above their head in this kind of moment of triumph, with a smile on their face that we should want all youth to possess. Thank you. Thank you all so much. I think we have time for questions, if there are any questions. Yeah.
What's next?
What's next? Well, so we've had 7 exhibitions, 1 online exhibition. We've collaborated with about 100 youth. In the last year, one bright spot of the pandemic is that because we went hybrid online, we're now across the entire state of Arizona. So we're working with the Queer Youth Center in Phoenix, and we want to keep that up. Now we have basically split. Half of our youth are coming from Southern Arizona, half of our youth are joining in from Northern Arizona, and we don't want to lose that support that we're offering. So I'm hoping to be able to add in a collaboration with the Phoenix Museum of Art. Yeah.
One of the other ideas that we've talked about and that we've submitted grants in the past around is also applying this to other marginalized youth populations. So not just LGBTQ youth, but any youth who experiences marginalization and lack of representation in that museum context or school context, and seeing, does that apply? Does this work with other youth populations as well?
Yeah.
You guys operate as your own 501c3, or where do you get your funding, or how do you exist?
Well, so the question, in case anyone didn't hear it, is where does our funding come from? Are we a 501c3? So we are at the University of Arizona Museum of Art. My funding, Mapping Q is a very scrappy program. I think when I first started, I funded it $400 from my own money when my wife and I got married, and it was the money that like people gave us when we first started. So that was like our seed money, and it paid for all the art supplies and the exhibition as well. So we do have some funding through funding through the museum, essentially, that funds for the art materials, and the exhibition is built into our exhibition budget every year. We do have some local foundations that have given us some small grants, and that's pretty much it. Yeah.
In terms of the research, the Alliance Foundation, which is one of the smaller community foundations in Tucson, helped fund some of that. And then the Institute for LGBT Studies has funded, at the University of Arizona, has funded some of this work, as well as some here and there seed grants to fund the work.
Yeah.
I'd like to support it though. Tell me if you don't take your money.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for the great presentation. I'm also interested in this kind of space of like bringing the art world and the academic world together, and I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how that has allowed you to kind of speak to diverse audiences, or what you've learned in working with each other that might be different from other kinds of collaboration.
I want to see what you say, Russ. I'm enmeshed in the art world, and we kind of think of it as research already, but those outside the arts usually don't value that information or the way that information is displayed, right?
Yeah, so the question, for those of you who couldn't hear it, was about the collaboration between the arts and research, which we often don't see much of. For me, it's been very personally rewarding as someone who actually started out in the arts. In terms of music education was my major for most of undergrad. So it's been amazing to get back into the art scene, but to utilize research. And so we were paired up actually by Research, Innovation, and Impact. It wasn't called that back then, but we were paired up by the university who put us together and said, hey, I think you all have similar interests, you should work together. And it's been incredible. I think one of the challenges is around funding. And so we've submitted to like typical research grant avenues, but I'm not sure that they're seeing the value of the arts as much as they might say another kind of prevention, socio-emotional learning type intervention.
Yeah. Yeah.
How did your collaboration start? And then when you actually started to work with you, how long was the training session before you had them start to create your own art? So how do you prepare them?
So the question was, how did we start working together? And then repeat the second question. I want to make sure I answer it right.
And the second one is more once you actually started, how did you first start to work with youth, and how long was the initial orientation for you with regards to the art and the museum and everything before you had them start to work on their own art?
So how long is the orientation before they start to work on their own art? It's immediate. I mean, I think that's one of the that I didn't speak to is this idea of mapping is intentionally our inspiration point, because maps themselves are very abstract works, but we instantly understand them and know them. And so that is often kind of our inspiration point of valuing this idea that there are other ways of being able to have a visual language that is not about realism or technical skill. While there are a lot of youth that have an amazing technical skill, and Mapping Q becomes a place where they can thrive with the ideas that they want to run with. But we do very little in very specific technical lessons unless some of the youth ask for it. Otherwise, it's just a lot of invitations and a lot of here's some materials, go for it. And whatever they make, whatever they submit is what we will exhibit. So there's no jurying of their work. Yeah.
Yeah. So the question was about, have we thought about the template for Mapping Q and applied it to different types or modes of art form? So dance or...
I have not. I love that idea, though. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's it's a really great question, and I only have it just because that's outside of my realm of expertise. But I think it's really important because while there are artists or there are youth who love art making, that it's not for everyone. There are youth who can express themselves really powerfully through dance, through music. There are so many other expressive modes of art making. I will say that in the last couple of years, one of the things that I've been building into our budget is bringing in visiting artists who identify as queer, so that the youth can then see themselves in practicing artists, see that representation in the art world that way. And we've brought in artists that are, performance artists working with video. So we're starting to kind of get outside of like the, pen and paper kind of art making. But I think that's a really, really great idea. I love that. Well, thank you all so much for coming. Thanks
you.
for sticking to the end.